Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCS Week 2 overview analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. Incredibly excited to get into Week 2 here. Of course, every LCS week is significantly longer now. We've got Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday every single week, so I do apologize for this video coming out a little bit late this past week. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you will know has not been the easiest when it comes to technology for me. We had some major power outages in my area all weekend long. I want to get these videos out usually either Saturday or Monday, but it had to get pushed to Wednesday this week just because of, the way everything ended up working out. And so, sorry, it's going to be coming out basically as games are going on, or maybe even after the first games of Week 3. But let's go ahead and get into the recap of Week 2. Incredibly excited to get into it. Let me know what you guys thought of Week 2 down in the comment section below. What teams overperformed your expectations? What teams underperformed your expectations? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, of course. What we do here, if you are new, is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. We'll be going over all 15 games in this video, and at the end of the week, I will be giving you my updated power rankings, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week. So I'm incredibly excited to kind of go over everything, and without further ado, it's time to jump in to day number 1, and we kick day 1 off in week number 2 with the matchup between Dignitas and Golden Guardians. That Golden Guardians was able to take the win in, and this is a really big win for them. I would say they didn't exactly look as good as I think we wanted them to in week number 1. In particular, I think the bot lane definitely took some steps back from what they were doing in the previous split. They were kind of the focal point, I would say, for a lot of what Golden Guardians wanted to do in the regular season, and even in the playoffs as well. They really like to play through bot in the early game, try to get them going, try to get them moving, so that they can then push the tempo forward, but that really wasn't the case in week number 1. The bot lane was just kind of meh for this team, and so I think they were really looking for some upgrades, and upgrades I do think they got this week. My player of the, I almost said player of the series, my player of the game here is going to go to Huhi in the support position, and I think Huhi was really, really good on the rel here. I think that his explosiveness, I think, really starts to come back out when we get more closer to that engaged support meta. He's been playing Enchanters, and I don't want to say that he's bad at Enchanters, because he's certainly not. Honestly, he's one of the more consistent supports in the entire league on Enchanter supports as well. He's just one of the best supports in NA, but he really is an engaged support, bread and butter kind of guy, especially in team fights. You can really see it when, you're fighting around objectives. His main priority is to try and zone the enemy off, and then to look for an engage to set up the rest of his team. And lucky for him, I mean, he's got damage on the rest of this team. Stixxay playing AP Varus, you've got Gory on the Akali, you've got River on the Kindred, hell, even Licorice on the Jax. There's so much potential to blow things up very quickly in team fights here. He just needs to be the one to kind of initiate everything, and to me, he was the most noticeable in this game. I think that there were quite a few members that you could give player of the game to, but for me, I'm going to give it to Huhi in the support position. Gory, I think, got it on broadcast. Totally understand. He was a really big part of their late game team fights. I just didn't think he was as explosive in terms of the early to mid game macro to kind of set Golden Guardians up into a position where they could team fight relatively easily in the back half of the game, but Gory still did his job well. Definitely the better mid laner in this game, and definitely worth commending. And then I thought River was the other player that really had a great game. We could talk about the Maokai and the Kindred matchup, a notoriously miserable matchup for Maokai, but River, I think, still played it incredibly well. You're going to have a lot of damage in these team fights, and again, when you've got a rel that's going to be able to set you up relatively conveniently almost every single time, Kindred's the type of champion that can capitalize on that better than almost anybody in the current meta. And so basically everybody on Golden Guardian stepping up and doing their job, and I think that's a really big positive to see. And then for Dignitas on the other side, not as good. A couple of positives to take away from this. I don't think Jensen was miserable, and I think Rich actually had some good moments in this game, and Rich has definitely been the best member of Dignitas across the beginning part of this season. Again, not that that's particularly surprising. Talked about that in my pre-split power rankings video, that Rich's style kind of complements the LCS's style incredibly well, because he's really not a good laner, but he's a really good team fighter, and laning just doesn't matter as much in the LCS, especially in the top lane. You just don't have a lot of players that are going to be able to take advantage of a more weak laning phase, and we've seen players that are weaker in that stage of the game that are good in team fights be really successful at this level. Impact definitely comes to mind as a player in that range, and I think Rich can have a very similar impact on this team. Unfortunately for him, there really just isn't a lot of synergy surrounding him. The bot lane has just been whatever. Ashe Milio is really not something that I think is all that good. I think you need a lot higher damage if you're going to go for something like Milio. The Ashe just doesn't necessarily fit into that for me. I've seen that pick start to rise in popularity, and we'll see it more this week from a couple of different teams, but it's really not something that I'm super stoked about right now. And then you're really relying on Santorin actually having pressure in the jungle, and that just was not the case in this game. Santorin's going to get my dud of the game here for the Maokai performance. Again, really rough matchup, so I don't want to blame it entirely on him, but he simply needs to be better. Like, Santorin has not gelled at all with anybody else in this team. I was very critical of him in spring. In fact, I was honestly overly critical of him in spring, and I think now public perception has caught up a little bit. He's probably been the worst, if not one of the worst junglers in the LCS so far this year, and I think he's really going to need to get back on track in order to have this team have any sort of success. And it's not that it's impossible or anything like that, it's just we need to see it. Him and Jensen really don't have any synergy together. They're both more supportive players, and neither really has this big carry player that they can kind of put their resources into. Tomo has certainly not been that rich. I guess theoretically could be that, but again, he's not really a great laner, and you don't really want to put a ton of early game resources into top lane at the current moment. And so I don't really know what Dignitas' strategy should be. I just know that whatever they're doing right now, it's not working, and this team is just kind of meh for it. But for Golden Guardians on the other side, they are still good. I kept them at number 3 in my power rankings even after a 1-2 first week because their schedule was very difficult. I wasn't going to hold that against them too much, but I think the talent was still more interesting on this team than it was on a lot of the other teams that were kind of around them in the area. They could continue to go up in the power rankings if everybody else continues to struggle, or I think 3 could be a relatively easy spot for them to stick at. Right now, they just look really good in general. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 1, and this one I was intrigued to see, just to see if that form from week 1 was real. We had Team Liquid taking on NRG, and Team Liquid does pick up the win here, which is really good. They moved to 4-0 to start this split. This is a team that really exploded in week number 1, really showed that some of the more micro adjustments and changes that they made in the offseason really were positive, at least for them in the early going. Now, it wasn't a perfect week number 1. They did still show some flaws in the part of the game that they were weakest at in spring, which was of course the late game, but their early game is just simply so much better than everybody else's in this region that oftentimes they can get away with it, and I do think that they are more consistent in the mid game now. But man, the individual talent of all of the players on this team, not just some of them, but all of them on this team is definitely starting to shine through, and it's really starting to show just how high of a ceiling this Team Liquid team could possibly have. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, kind of a tough choice because this really was kind of a team effort more than it was one individual player, but I'm going to give it to Jan in the bot lane. I think Core absolutely could get this. I think Pioshik, I think Summit could absolutely get this. All of them played incredibly well, right? Team Liquid's just a very well-rounded team at the current moment, but Jan is just able to take over the game in terms of damage in a way that I don't think he gets the same kind of credit for as the other top 80 carries in the league. I'm not saying that Jan is just as good as every other 80 carry in the league, but he's certainly on his way to being there, and I talked a lot in spring about how I felt the reputation kind of surrounding him was not fair, and that he certainly was better than people were giving him credit for, and that is absolutely still the case. This was the best part of Team Liquid in spring, this bot lane, and it's going to continue to be a really big positive for them. I have a major feeling. FBI and Ignar are not pushovers, but Jan and Core were simply just better than them in this series, so that's good. Jan, I think, is an upcoming superstar here in the LCS, and then Core just continues to be great. It feels like he's starting to get back on track. Again, another player who I think was a lot better than people gave him credit for in spring because the team wasn't doing well. His individual plays I thought were actually really good, and I think him and Jan actually are really good in the early 2v2, and that definitely translated. Just talked about who he's rel. Core's rel is also fantastic, and again, going back to that more engaged style support meta, especially here in North America, I think is going to benefit him a lot. This bot lane is super fun to watch, and they're both really good players, but like I said, top side of the map weren't slouches either. That Kennen diving on the backline, especially as a follow-up to full rel engage, was incredibly difficult to deal with on the side of Energy, who just don't really have a lot of survivability outside of the Ivern shields, and so you're really hoping and relying on the fact that Kai'Sa or Aphelios don't get immediately blown up by the full engage combo, and Summit made that significantly more difficult. Again, if he can just shore up his team fighting, he's going to be one of the best top laners in the league. Pioshik was really good on the Vi. He's very team dependent in my opinion. When the team is confident and playing well and, playing fast and aggressive especially, I think he's going to look great, but he's also just going to have some games where he's not as good. This was a good one, though, and he's been really good to start this split. And then Harry on the static Shiv LeBlanc. He was good as well. I still don't think he's going to be like a superstar in the mid lane for this team, but as a secondary carry, as somebody who you can put in a side lane and create pressure, like that's one of the better, players of that role in the league at the current moment. He's going to fill that role better than almost anybody else will. And so for Team Liquid, they're just a very scary team in terms of construction, and I think they've executed on basically everything they wanted to see. The coaching change and obviously the Netherlands boot camp helped them out a ton, which is really fun to see. And then for Energy, I'm a little bit concerned about this team. I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to pull the full panic plug at the moment for them, but there are definitely some things that we've seen through the first, week and a game, I guess you could say here, that have not given me the confidence that this team is going to be very good this split. Most notably, this bot lane. FBI is going to get my dud of the game here, and as much as I like FBI, him and Ignar do not seem to work well together. Their laning phase in particular has been really bad, which has always been a strength of FBI, and so that definitely is something that concerns me. I don't think it's just them, though. I think a lot of people are going to see that that is the change that this team made, and now all of a sudden they're worse, and they're going to say that everything is on FBI and everything is on Ignar. It's the same, kind of sentiment that I think a lot of other teams in the world have gotten. I think Koi definitely was the poster child of this kind of narrative where you make one change in the offseason, all of a sudden the team's not as good, so it must be the change that is playing bad, when there are a myriad of other factors. I think the top side of this map is not nearly as explosive. Dokla has just not been as good at the start of this split. He's been on tank duty more than I would like, and Contracts is always going to be a relatively up and down player. Really interesting to see him on the Ivor in this game. It didn't necessarily work, but I can get the idea behind it. Palafox, though, was pretty bad in week 1, was definitely kind of the saving grace for energy in this game, and was the only one even remotely trying to make this interesting. We've seen the Kai'Sa mid as an answer to Static Shiv LeBlanc elsewhere in the world, most notably VTO for Heretics in the LEC, and it really has worked. It's a pick that I find very intriguing and interesting, and it's been something that has had success. Obviously, the rest of the team was just not able to hold up, but certainly something we could see being pulled out more so in the future. But for energy, I am getting concerned. 1-3 is not like a death sentence in terms of record, but the form that they're in is certainly not a great thing to show, and so they're going to need to figure things out relatively quickly, or I'm going to start to get concerned that this is a bottom 3 or 4 team in the league. And then for Team Liquid, they look great right now. 4-0 is great, but their schedule is only going to get more difficult. If they can keep this up against teams that are in good form at the current moment, as this schedule starts to increase in difficulty, it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. But right now, it feels like the consistency of this team has just skyrocketed through the roof, and we already knew they had the talent to back that up. And then moving on to our third game of day 1, and it's one that I think we all were kind of hoping would be an interesting matchup, but man, with current results, it just wasn't. We had FlyQuest taking on Cloud9, a matchup of what a lot of people consider to be the two best teams moving into the split. And Cloud9 is able to take it in dominant fashion, putting Fly at 0-4 to start this split. And man, it's just not going well for them. But 4-0 for Cloud9, not particularly surprising. They really just are the best team in the LCS, at least until proven otherwise. Their consistency is just through the roof compared to basically everyone else. And obviously, they've got the top-end talent that should make them the best team in the league. And they're really just kind of walking and proving that they kind of are right now. I still like this team a lot. I've gotten criticism in the past for overhyping this team too much, but I really don't think that is the case. I think Cloud9 is legitimately just as good as you could possibly get at this level right now, and I think they're going to continue to look great. Player of the game for me is going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. You can't really allow a player of that kind of explosiveness to have Nico. I get that you banned out the LeBlanc, and you feel like you need to ban out the Varus, I guess. Don't really get that, but you can't really let him have Nico. This is something that he can't really be allowed to have. Eminus is someone who has struggled on non-meta picks in the past. He's someone who is, when he's been pushed down, kind of his priority list has not looked nearly as good, but he really hasn't had to be pushed down in the priority list really all that much this split so far, and he's looked great in the time that he has had. He's really emerged as one of the best mid laners in the league, and it's not really all that close anymore. There are a couple of mids that I think are playing really well and at a super high level right now. Obviously, Jojo Pyun comes to mind as the other mid laner that's looking really good, but Eminus, to me, is right there with him as a player that definitely has to be acknowledged for having a really good split at the current moment, and it was really fun to watch him here. Berserker and Sven continue to be the most dominant bot lane in the entire league, especially with Prince and Vulcan just not clicking and not connecting at all. Even on something like the Kai'Sa Nautilus, like, that's something that really shouldn't have any prio or pressure at all into Aphelios Thresh, but they were so much better in lane that they were able to generate a lead. You've got Fudge on the Kennen in the top lane, and while there were some moments where he didn't look as good in lane against the Renekton, he more than made up for it with a lot of his teamfight presence, which Fudge is going to do. He's really good at every phase of the game, and so even if he struggles for like 10 minutes, I expect him to be able to turn it around. And Blabber on the Nocturne, a pick that he was very comfortable on back like 2018, 2019, when we go back to like when he first started getting into the LCS, he was playing a lot of Nocturne. Really good to see him back on it here, but this was like the support Nocturne, which is very weird thing to say, kind of an initiator Nocturne. Nocturne plus Nico is a very scary engaged duo, and you've already got the Kai'Sa, you've got the Kennen, you've got the Nautilus. You've got a ton of tools to be able to follow up on it, and so C9 just taking this aggressive comp, playing it really aggressively, outplaying FlyQuest and winning the game. Not particularly surprising, but it is good to see. And then for Fly on the other side, like, what do you want me to say about this team? Because I don't know what to say about this team. They're just not working right now. Whatever's going on communication-wise or mental-wise, like, they've got to figure it out. Because it's not just, you know, they're making bad plays and throwing away leads that their mechanically talented players have. It's not Team Liquid. This team just has no phase of the game where they look good right now. My dud of the game is going to go to Vikla, but man, you want to give this to Prince? Sure. You want to give this to Vulcan? Sure. Like, all of them are playing miserable right now. And it's not, again, just macro. It's mechanically. Like, Vikla's mechanics have completely disappeared. Prince's mechanics have completely disappeared. Like, I can't explain it. Even the biggest detractors from these two would say that, mechanically speaking, last split, they were among the best players in their position. That was pretty inarguable. The impact they had on the game, you could argue that, right? I know a lot of people did, and there was some back and forth arguments, but you couldn't argue that they were mechanically talented. That's gone in summer, and I don't know where it went, and it's got to be frustrating towards this team, and I imagine it's making them play even worse at the current moment. Vikla looks miserable. Prince and Vulcan look like one of the worst bot lanes in the entire league at the current moment. Impact was good on the top side, but Spica didn't make any sort of plays to bring the team back or to bring the game back. I just don't know what to say about FlyQuest. They look miserable. They look like one of the worst teams in the entire league. I don't know how much longer I can say that I'm expecting this talent to be able to figure it out and bounce back. I wanted to give them some leniency after week number 1, and yes, this is only game number 1 and it's Cloud9, but man, it was miserable. They did not look competitive, and that's certainly concerning, but congratulations to C9 for being able to take the game and move to 4-0. They look fantastic. They clearly are the best team in the LCS right now, and it's going to take a pretty monumental Herculean effort for any of the other teams to catch up, in my opinion. And then moving on to game number 4 here, and game 4 was one between two teams that I had near the bottom, actually at the bottom of my pre-split power rankings. I had TSM taking on Immortals here, and TSM is able to pick up the win. This isn't particularly surprising when you look at maybe the strength of the rosters on paper, but at least in week 1, Immortals actually looked relatively good, and they certainly weren't a team that I was starting to freak out about. I thought TSM was a bottom 2 team and really didn't show as much as maybe some of the other teams in that same area, and so to see TSM come out and be able to pick up the win here, it's not surprising, but I guess it's good to see. It's one of those situations where I'll talk about this with a few different LCS organizations, but you hate the org, you love the players, right? Like, it's hard to not cheer for TSM because Haunter and Insanity and Wild Turtle and Chime and even Boogie are all players that I want to cheer for. I want to see them do well, but man, really hard to like this TSM organization, but bias aside, player of the series for me is going to go to Insanity, and I say bias aside, but still got to be at least a little bit biased here because I talked about this a lot at the beginning of the split. Ruby was supposed to come in and be the starting mid laner, but visa complications happened, and he wasn't going to be here to start the split, so they signed Insanity to cover that spot at the beginning, and we were like, okay, that's good. Insanity's probably a better player than Ruby, is what I said, I think verbatim in my pre-split power rankings, is that they're going to find out very quickly that Insanity is just better than Ruby, and what have they found out? Insanity is just better than Ruby. The dude is actually really good, like maybe a top 5 mid laner in the LCS. He's somewhere in that area, was a little bit inconsistent in spring on Dignitas challengers, but that's only because I think that the rest of the team really needed a lot of resources, and he was the one that was taking most of the backseat. Still a phenomenal player and has always been crazy talented. Was phenomenal for them in their playoff run, and so to see him pick up the Graves mid, I think for the first time in LCS history in this game and just kind of dominate on it, yeah, he's pretty damn good, and he definitely deserved player of the game. If he sticks in, I think TSM's upside is a lot higher. I don't think that they are a bottom 2 team with Insanity in. I think Ruby potentially coming in and starting in the mid lane would affect this team a little bit, and I don't really know what's going to end up happening because Ruby's been waiting for this visa, and to imagine, waiting for a visa and finally getting to go all the way to a new country and then only to get there and get immediately benched, like that would be a really rough situation on a personal perspective, but Insanity probably is the better player, so certainly interesting decisions to be made for TSM, but the rest of this team was also good. Chime is awesome. He's not going to get nearly the credit that he deserves for being as good in the support position as he is, but Chime is really, really good, and he's been good for a while, was phenomenal in 2022, in my opinion. A big reason why TSM went on that massive run towards the back half of last year, and he continues to be a positive, not nearly as much so as he was last year, but still a really good player. And then Haunter on the Cassante. Love me some Haunter. I think he's a really underrated player, an upper half top laner probably in the league, and continues to show that. I think he's a player that I expect to continue to be a positive. Boogie, Wild Turtle. Wild Turtle's had some really good moments, especially last split. Was really, really solid. And then Boogie, he's more than solid as a jungler. There are a couple junglers that I've talked about in multiple different regions where they are fine. They are certainly good enough to be able to win with. They're not really going to drag you across the finish line, but they're going to be good enough to be able to push you forward, and Boogie is one of those for me. And so TSM has a good construction of talent. It's just about what kind of a collection that they end up using in the rest of their series, because right now, I think it's actually looking pretty good. But for Immortals, Immortals kind of coming back down to earth in this series. They looked way better than we all expected them to in week number 1. Going 2-1, yes, against an easier schedule, but beating teams that I don't think we kind of expected them to be able to beat. This game felt a lot more similar to what we were expecting from them. Just kind of getting outplayed in a lot of different areas. My dud of the game is going to go to Kenvi in the jungle. He was fine on the Sejuani. I mean, really, Sej is one of those picks where when it doesn't go well, it looks really bad because you have to go all in. You have to really set up the rest of your team, and if you're not tanky, you're just going to die instantly in that CC chain that Sejuani is so known for. It's just not going to be there, and that was the case for Kenvi. Really behind the 8 ball in terms of macro in this game, and obviously, it's going to happen every once in a while. Kenvi's had bad games at the LCS level before, and he's never really been as good on these, I don't want to say more supportive initiators, but he's better on Vi and Wukong than he is on Sejuani and Maokai. That just kind of is the case. Obviously, you want to see him on Kindred, but it's going to get permanently banned out. Even something like the Graves has been a really big pick for him in the past, but for now, if Kenvi's forced to play these more secondary, like supportive carry type, or supportive engage type of junglers, I just don't think he's going to look as good. Treats was also kind of bad in this game on the Nautilus, a couple of really poor engages. Solo got outplayed by Sion. Tactical was really nothing on the Varus into a bunch of tanks, and then Balulu had moments where he looked like he was dealing damage, but by the end of the game, he was doing literally nothing, and so Immortals just kind of outscaled and outplayed here, outdrafted in my opinion, and so they're going to take their spot at 500, and so is TSM now moving up to 2-2. This team looks okay. I don't think either of these teams are really, contenders, especially with the way the LCS is currently going, but it is a nice win for TSM to have on their resume. And then moving on to our 5th and final game here of the first day in week number 2, we had an intriguing matchup between 100 Thieves and Evil Geniuses. The debut of 100 Thieves' actual mid laner here did not go according to plan as Evil Geniuses rout them in this game, and they're able to take the win and continue to look really good at the start of this split, whereas 100 Thieves are not. Their only win so far is against the winless FlyQuest, which is looking worse and worse as every single game ends up going on, but Evil Geniuses really showing that they deserve to be taken seriously, and this is a team that very well could compete for top of the table, and that's a really cool thing to say considering they just replaced 4 out of the 5 members of this roster. So let's go ahead and talk about what they did in this game that ended up being a huge positive for them. Player of the game for me is going to go to Armeo in the jungle, and man, I'm so happy to see Armeo doing well. Really excited to see him play well at the LCS level, because that was always something that was a little bit up in the air. He was a great player for Academy for so long in Team Liquid's system, and being almost a player coach, then also like one of the better players on that team for so long, really, I think, separated him from a lot of the other players at that level. But, before that, his time in the LCS, he had never really looked up to the standard that I think we wanted him to, or that he did in Academy, whether that was on Echo Fox, whether that was on TSM. It had just never clicked in that same way, but it feels like with this Evil Geniuses team, it finally is starting to click in a much better way, and man, he dominated on the Viego in this game. Very easy choice for me, but him and Jojo Pune are very quickly becoming one of the better jungle mid duos in the entire LCS, and for as quick as this team has had to kind of turn things around and to get all their players used to playing with each other, like their synergy is actually ridiculous. Both of them are very good players. Obviously, Jojo much more of a resource heavy player, but Armeo more of a supportive style jungler. The roles were flipped in this one though. Jojo playing that RE, shoving and roaming, playing for his jungle, and that Viego really getting far ahead. It's really fun to see. Jojo's been one of the best mid laners in the entire region so far this split, if not the single best one. The dude was absolutely cracked in week number 1, and he continues to look really good here. He's, according to a lot of reports, the primary shot caller for this team at the current moment, and their macro's actually been very good, and so if they can keep that up, whatever synergy's going on between those two, and even the rest of the team, I think that's going to be big. Ayla's also been fantastic. Really love that he's finally getting a chance to shine, really show kind of the good parts of him that we saw on Team Liquid Academy for so many years. Getting to play with Armeo again, I think, is definitely a positive, but in general, it just feels like the pressure has kind of been taken off of him, and he feels a lot more comfortable, just going out there and playing the game rather than feeling all these expectations to play with some of the most mechanically talented players in the league, with a system that was kind of set up before he even got here, like he did on FlyQuest last split. So him and Unforgiven look great. Always good to see Unforgiven go up against the team that kept him in Academy for a split and just kind of beat them, even if he wasn't the focal point. And Revenge was solid too on the top side. Evil Geniuses just looks very complete right now, and you got to be excited about that if you're a fan. But for 100 Thieves on the other side, debut of your new mid laner, Quid. He finally is in here. Nukeduck is back into the head coach position. He's no longer going to be playing for this team, and there certainly were better games for a debut. Kind of similar to what we saw from Eminus, although I would say this was worse than what Eminus had last split in his debut game. Quid was pretty miserable. He's going to be coming in here, and he's going to immediately be getting a dud of the game here for 100 Thieves. So it's just very bad on the Azir, consistently taken advantage of by the Viego. His positioning was really bad. Like, he was way too far far forward in pretty much every circumstance and really never got any damage off because of it, which is obviously going to be a major issue. But this was the thing about Quid. I talked about this. His tape was actually really good, and I understand the idea of 100 Thieves saying, like, this could be our next guy, like, we're going to bring him in, and he could be a really big upgrade to a player like Bjergsen because of his mechanical talent, but let's take a look at, like, what has happened for him in recent months, and this is kind of what I was talking about in my primer video, where I said Quid was the best player on a really bad team, and they weren't winning. Like, he's not won a lot in terms of his LoL career up until this point, and so gonna be interesting to see if he can translate that same kind of success to a team that maybe wants to play through different avenues. He was definitely the guy on Gen G Challengers, and he's not going to be the guy here on 100 Thieves. That's going to be Doublelift, and so going to be interesting to see if he adjusts, but it wasn't just him. Closer continues to play really poorly for this team. It just feels like he doesn't want to do anything. He's super scared to make plays, and on Vi, especially going into something like Viego, that is a death sentence. You can't get behind on that champion and expect to still be competitive, and so those two were definitely the standouts in a negative way. Doublelift and Busio were just kind of whatever. Someday actually had some pretty good moments on the Cassante. Again, another top laner that's trying to keep his team in the game, very similar to what we said about Impact early on in the day, but just not enough to actually be able to keep it close, and so for 100 Thieves, they might actually be a bad team, like just straight up. Them and FlyQuest are certainly super underperforming right now, but I have significantly less confidence in 100 Thieves' talent to be able to pull through. Quid is someone who I already was a little bit lower on. Closer has just been bad, and Doublelift and Busio are going to have to step up, and someday is going to have to be the best top laner in the league for this team to be like a top 6 caliber team, because right now, they just don't look it. But for Evil Geniuses, they definitely are. This could be a top of the table team if everything continues to click. It just feels like all of these players are super happy to be playing with each other and on a team with lower expectations and I guess anticipation than maybe some of the situations that they had been put in before. All of them looking great in the opportunity they've been given, and honestly, this team could be a sneaky contender to make finals. And then moving on to our day number 2 here in week number 2 of the LCS. Of course, it's still super weeks every single week because of the way the schedule ended up working out. So kicking off our middle day is a matchup between NRG and TSM. The TSM is able to take, kind of surprisingly, you know, they looked a lot better on day number 1 here than I think they did in week number 1, and NRG really has just not found any sort of footing so far this split, so maybe form-wise, we really shouldn't be surprised by the outcome of this game, but I think talent-wise, I definitely am. TSM should not be the kind of team that's taking down NRG, but honestly, TSM looking pretty good so far this week. A 2-0 start is exactly what you were looking for, and obviously, this rivalry is not quite what it once was with CLG turning into NRG. It's not quite TSM CLG, but still, to see TSM coming out on top, I think is going to give a lot of people some nostalgia flashbacks. But let's go ahead and go over what happened in this game. Player of the game for me, pretty easily is going to go to Wild Turtle in the bot lane. He's actually been very quietly very good for this TSM team. He was like average at best, I would say, in Academy last split. He was very up and down, was not a great laner. TSM in general, their challengers team was just really not all that good, and so really there wasn't a lot to sing about in terms of Wild Turtle when they brought him up. It really just felt like, they don't like Neo. That really is what it is, right? They don't love Wild Turtle, but they don't like Neo even more, and so he ends up going down. But Turtle, ever since he joined that LCS team, has been playing the best league that he's played in quite a long time, and I think that's really impressive stuff. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep that up. He was like very, very good towards the back half of spring, and he's been pretty solid towards the beginning of summer here. Not a superstar in that bot lane position, but they don't really need him to be a superstar. They just need him to be a quality starter, and so far that's what he has been, a quality starter. Chime is still really good. I think he still has some up and down plays. He's certainly going to make some mistakes, but he was phenomenal on the Rakan in this game, and again, if he can get out moving on the map and be more proactive and be more active, that's really what he wants to do. He wants to be able to make plays. He's a playmaker. He wants to be able to move with his jungle in particular. If you get a style where you can leave Wild Turtle a little bit more isolated in the bot lane, at least in the early game, maybe play around Insanity or the mid lane in general just a little bit more, I think that's going to help TSM. They did that a lot in this game. And then Haunter continues to look really good. It's so funny. Haunter and Wild Turtle, you know, actually look really good in 2023. Both of them have kicked off the split actually being really solid, and so I gotta give him a lot of credit for that. The Cassante is a super overloaded pick, but he still has looked very good on other things as well. I just think Haunter's currently playing well, and TSM is benefiting from it. I still don't know if this team is like top 6 worthy, but they're certainly making it a lot more interesting than what I was giving them credit for. And then for NRG, like I said before, this team just doesn't have the cohesion. Dud of the game again is going to go to FBI. He really has just not clicked with the rest of this team. I don't really know what it is, but his Aphelios has taken some major downgrades. Even just his gun management has been really bad this split, and that's not something that he has been really all that poor at in previous splits, or at least this poor at in previous splits. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Clearly it's mental, and clearly it's just not able to click. Like, these players just aren't clicking in the same way. I mean, FBI has been very good on basically every other team that he's played for, so to have him struggle here is a little bit of a surprise, and certainly for him to be a targetable area for other teams is a bit of a surprise, because that's not really what he's been over the course of his career. Him and Ignar certainly don't seem to have any sort of chemistry in the early 2v2. They've been better in team fights, but still, I want to see a bit more out of them. Palafox, I think, has stepped up this week. He was probably their worst player in week number 1. I think I actually gave him dud of the week in the first week of the split, but he's been much better, probably their most consistent player across week 2, but again, topside's also not been good. Dokla lost really hard to Hanser. Contracts had no pressure in the matchup against Boogie here. You just need to see NRG step up, because right now they just look incredibly inefficient, and that's going to be something that continues to haunt them. That is a real problem, and that's something that I think you could genuinely be concerned about. But this team is very scarily looking like maybe a bottom 2 team, and remember, bottom 2 teams miss the playoffs, and so this team needs to get their ass into gear, or else they're going to be kind of on the outside looking in, maybe the further along we go into this split. But for TSM, they look pretty solid so far this week. Obviously, you're hoping that they're going to be able to keep it up, because you like these players, especially the veterans who have really endeared themselves to the community, but they're going to need to do it against teams that aren't NRG and Immortals, right? As good as the wins are this week so far, the schedule is definitely going to get a little bit harder as they move forward, and they're going to need to be able to step up in the same kind of way. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2 here, and it's a battle, I guess I should say, between two 500 teams. We had Golden Guardians taking on Immortals, and Golden Guardians does pick up the win. They are able to get their third win of the split. They're able to move to 3-2 after a rough 1-2 week number 1, and they do it by just being more in meta now that the patch has officially rolled over. This is basically exactly what we wanted to see. This team is really adapting to some of the new picks and some of the buffed things a lot better than the other teams in the region at the current moment, and I think that's really going to give them a lot of advantages. They were definitely the better team in this game, and it really was by a lot. There were multiple lanes that ended up winning very hard, but it was mostly on the bottom side of the map, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is once again going to go to Huhi in the support position. He's just so good on this rel. It really is noticeable how much better he is than other supports when he gets to play something that can be so engage-oriented. He's just got the mind for where he needs to be, especially in the mid-game, to try and create plays, to try and take a gold lead that maybe they've already generated and make it even bigger for the team, and so really, really fun stuff to watch. Obviously, he pairs really well with the rest of this team, but Huhi was the primary guy again in this game, and I really do think that he is, in my opinion, clearly the #1 support in North America right now. With Vulcan struggling, with Core not having the same kind of immediate pressure, I just think Huhi has cemented himself as the #1 support in North America, and it's really, really fun to watch at the current moment. Gory was also fantastic, of course, getting a Penta here on the NA Jace in the mid lane. Always going to be a little bit of a fun scenario. We really haven't seen Jace be all that effective in the LCS, and again, haha, funny NA Jace meme, but we saw a lot of people pick it up in spring, especially towards the back half of the split. Players like Eminus definitely come to mind, and they did not pilot it nearly as well as Gory did in this game. He was incredibly consistent all of last split, although I think his highs were a little bit overstated. I think the team didn't play through him nearly as much as maybe Reddit would tell you they did, but I still think that Gory was a really good player, and obviously I ranked him very highly going into this split, and so far he's definitely capitalized on that. Stixxay was really good on the Varus. AP Varus just absolutely shreds tanks. Ornn is not going to be able to do anything in this matchup going into that Varus, and it was very clear. But that bot side of the map, those three players were definitely the standouts. Licorice and River were also good, especially River, who did set up quite a few plays on the Sejuani, but Huhi and Gory in particular are the two standout members of the Golden Guardians this game, and then Stixxay also had a couple of really nice plays overall. So GG looking good, and then Immortals, kind of like I said earlier, falling back down to earth at least a little bit this week. Kenvy's going to get my dud of the game again here on the Wukong. He just lost pressure so early in this game, and if you do that against Sejuani, against this Varus Rel bot lane, it's gonna be a pretty major problem. The team really had no way of being able to catch back up. They tried to force some plays towards the back half of the game, but oftentimes those plays were just not coordinated really at all. I almost gave this dud of the game to Treats in the support position. He was really bad this game, just engaging without the rest of his team. I'm not exactly sure if you can blame that on him or if you want to blame the rest of the team for not being there to follow up on a lot of the engages and a lot of the plays that he he ended up trying to make, but whatever the reason, he was not good, and it ended up costing this team a lot of pressure, especially in the mid game. Any hope of getting back into the game was kind of dashed by both Kenvi and Treats just not really being on the same page as everybody else. If you're looking for positives, Tactical was a nice takeaway from this game. He's got very good mechanics, and we've always known that. The problem with him has always been the one or two really bad plays a game, and those so far this split, knock on wood, have really not been there, and that's a positive takeaway. Of course, a lot of people are talking about, Treats and Tactical reuniting, kind of saving Tactical's mental and trying to get him back on the right path. That has kind of been the case, and maybe if you want to make that argument, that can be true in this kind of scenario, but the problem is that Treats isn't playing particularly well at the current moment, and so even if he is getting Tactical back on the right track, I'm not sure it's a net positive for Immortals at the current moment, but again, they were much better in week number 1, and so I imagine that you're just kind of hoping that this is going to be able to turn back around. Maybe they're not going to be a top 6 team, but really, they did not look like a bottom 2 team in week number 1. So far in week number 2, they definitely do look like a relative bottom tier team, and that's not very good. But for Golden Guardians, I feel pretty justified and vindicated for keeping them at number 3 after a rough week number 1. I figured they'd be able to figure things out, especially with the meta more so moving into their favor, and I was spot on with that. Huki has been phenomenal. Gory has been really good this week. Those are the 2 players that you really want to point out for Golden Guardians, but everybody else is also upholding their end of the bargain and upholding their role. GG just looks like they're back into the form that they were at their best in spring, and that is a very dangerous team in the LCS. And then moving on to our third game of day number 2 here, and it's another intriguing matchup between 2 organizations that have been interesting in the past. We had 100 Thieves taking on Cloud9. And C9 continues their winning ways, continuing to stay undefeated here and moving to 5-0 to start the split. Really good stuff from them. Again, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself so much when I talk about this team over the course of this split because there really isn't a lot of new information to say about Cloud9. They just continue to look really good, and they continue to be really good in this game, I should say. And really, I think the consistency of this team is super high, especially compared to everybody else in the LCS, who just can't seem to figure it out. I don't think that they're perfect, but I do think that they're pretty damn close, and they're definitely the most consistent team in the West right now. I think you could say that they don't have the highest upside, but there's no other team in the West that is dominating their region quite like Cloud9 at the current moment, and you just got to give them a lot of props for that. This team has figured out how to win domestically. They just have to figure out how to transition that into more now, but man, this team's talent level is absurd, right? It's fantastic, and it's really, really good for this level, so let's go ahead and talk about it very quickly because player of the game is going to go to Berserker. He just is awesome. He's the best player in the LCS. I don't even think it's really all that debatable anymore. Him and Blabber are going to fight over that title. I would have said Prince was in that conversation at the beginning of the split, but not so much right now. He's certainly not informed to be that guy right now, but Berserker, I think, pretty clearly holds the title. I know a lot of people, especially on Reddit, are going to complain about Zeri Yumi, yada, 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 right? And I get it, right? The pick is still strong. Static Shiv is now being built on Zeri Yumi, and Triforce is not, as good, and so, maybe it's more annoying, or maybe it's less good, or whatever you want to say about Zeri. There are a ton of different opinions I think you could realistically have, but for those of you who only watch my LCS videos and don't watch my LCK videos in particular, or even my LPL videos, I've been very adamant and very vocal about a sentiment that I've held all year long, which is the fact that Zeri Yumi is super overhyped. It is fine. It's a very good bot lane, and Zeri is one of those AD carries that just kind of lets great players be great, right? It gives a very good player like Berserker all the tools that he needs in order to be the best AD carry in the game and to really take over and win the game on his own. But if you took Berserker out in this game and you put in, I don't know, Tomo, right? C9 doesn't have nearly as easy of a game here. Berserker still has to pilot it at a high level. It's not just a plug and play, anybody can play Zeri kind of pick. You still have to be super freaking good at this champion in order to pull her off, and it really has, over the course of this year so far, separated the best AD carries from the mediocre ones, the ones who can make Zeri look busted. It's pretty much exclusively the best AD carries in the world that have been able to do that. She has a 41% win rate in the LPL this year. If you're not good enough to be able to pilot her, you still aren't going to be able to get the same kind of results on her, and so I don't want the credit to go to the champion. I want the credit to go to the player, because I do think that the player is the one that's piloting her at a high level, and that's what makes Berserker so difficult, is when you give him a champion that has tools, that lets him flex his mechanics, that gives him the opportunity to kind of create his own advantages from a position that notoriously doesn't have that option, then he's going to be able to take over the game, and I think that's pro him and not anti the champion, in my opinion. I'm not trying to say that there aren't any problems with Zeri. I've never tried to make that argument, but what I'm saying is that I certainly don't think Zeri is the same kind of issue as something like Cassante to me that just takes significantly less to get going. I think you have to be a good player on Zeri or else it just doesn't matter. And so, yeah, Berserker and Sven are still really good. Berserker's the best team fighter. He's the best player in the LCS, and he showed that off again. Eminus is super good. Actually has learned how to play the Jace, which is a really big upgrade over what he was last split, although he's going into Quid, who has just not adapted to the LCS well so far. Blabber was good on Maokai. Fudge was good on Cassante. It's just Cloud9. They're really good, and they know how to win games. They're very, very difficult to play against from behind, and that's what 100 Thieves had to do here. And 400 team, they're just not very good right now. They start the season 1-4, and honestly, I'm not particularly surprised to see some of the players that really struggled in spring continue to struggle in summer. I think is not a shock towards this team, especially considering you're bringing in a new mid laner here who is not meshed well, at least in the first couple of games. Quid is going to get my dud of the game again here, and I want to be very clear. I'm not going to overreact to a couple of bad games from Quid. I'm not going to say that he's an awful investment and that he's clearly not going to be good enough to play at this level. He's had very little time to play with this team, about a week. He's just moved into the country, and so I want to give him some time to get comfortable, to get adjusted, and maybe we're going to get to see his true talent level in a little bit, but through the first week that he's been here, it's really not been all that good so far. Got completely outplayed by Eminus. Those Nico ultimates were just doing absolutely nothing throughout the majority of this game, but it's not like anybody else on this team was really stepping up. Closer continues to get out jungled, especially in the early game, not really having that aggression that we've kind of known him for over the beginning part of his career. Doublelift and Busio are certainly not getting the same kind of resources that they got in the early game last split, and they're definitely looking much poorer for it, and some days just fine in the top lane. It's hard to win the game from the top lane. It really just is, especially on a pick like Sion. And so 100 Thieves need to figure something out. They don't really have a game plan right now. They don't really know how they want to win the game, and I think it's really becoming a major issue for them. It just feels like this team is mentally lost. Hopefully they can figure it out, because right now it looks pretty bad, to be honest. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, they're the best team in the league. I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. They're really freaking good, and I imagine they're going to continue to be really freaking good. And then moving on to our fourth game of day number 2 here, and it is a little bit of an upset. Certainly not the last one we're going to get this week, but we had Dignitas taking on Team Liquid. And Dignitas does pick up the win here to move to 2-3 and give Team Liquid their first loss of the split. That ends the undefeated run for them. That means that the only undefeated team left in the LCS is Cloud9, and so certainly going to be intriguing to see that, but congratulations to Dignitas. I was really doubting this team after week number 1. It felt like Rich was playing well, but this mid-jungle still was not getting on the same page. Bot lane was not very good, one of the worst in the league in week number 1, and so I was just pretty out on the upside of what this team was going to be able to do, especially against teams that were just going to be able to outskill them, and Team Liquid felt like one of the teams that was going to fall into that kind of trap, but Team Liquid continues to struggle at the same things that they have struggled at forever, which is late game team fighting and being able to kind of secure games towards the back half. Dignitas, taking some hits in this game, definitely not being 100% consistent, but being able to come out on top, even being down 4 kills in this game, and looking relatively good doing it. My player of the game is going to go to Rich in the top lane. He continues to be by far the best player on Dignitas. I don't even think it's relatively close. Jensen has had some moments, and I think Tomo also has had some moments, but Santorin and Diamond have certainly been problematic, and I don't think Jensen and Tomo have been consistent by really any metric. It's really been Rich in the top lane that has been the guy to keep watching on Dig, and I'm not surprised. Again, he fits super well into the LCS in terms of playstyle, and I'm not surprised to see him really adapt to playing here very, very well and very quick. Going into a matchup like Summit, that's a matchup I could see going either way. Like, in terms of Summit, I could see destroying Rich in lane and just making it very difficult for him to be able to play the game towards the back half because he's so behind. But I could also see Rich just kind of surviving and Summit not really being as good of a team fighter as Rich. And so, in this game, it ends up going to the Cassante because that champion is overloaded into oblivion. He is what everybody thinks Zeri is, in my opinion. And it's really, really, frustrating to watch at times. But still, Rich pilots him at a very high level. He's better than almost every other Cassante in North America, although we've already seen what a ton of North American top laners can do on this champion, and it's pretty damn good. Rich is just a good player, and it's good to see him continue to play well. Like I said, Jensen was also super impactful. Finally got him back on some of the picks that he's most comfortable on. Obviously, he can play carries. He can play things like the Azir that are more for damage, and he can play the Annie, but Orianna, that's his bread and butter. That's his pick. Ori, Anivia, Zilly, and that kind of stuff. That's what he's known for. That's what I think of when I think of Jensen. So to see him be able to pull it out here, I think, is a good sign that this team feels comfortable comfortable enough to be able to put him on the champions that he still is actually very good on and isn't going to take him off of his style. Tomo and Diamond were fine towards the back half. I'm going to talk about Yan and Core because I actually think they were phenomenal in this game, but for the most part, Dignitas was able to get the job done mostly off the back of that Cassante. But for Team Liquid on the other side, just weren't able to get it done in the back half of this game, and it's got to be frustrating because Yan in particular looked nuts in this game. He continues to be awesome for this team, and I don't know how much longer people can deny how good he is. I've seen a lot of people write him off because, oh, Team Liquid makes his job super easy. Summit and Pioshik win early, Core JJ's a very good support, and so Yan doing well is just the product of the rest of the team, and I can understand that mentality, I can understand that kind of analysis, but the film and the tape just doesn't back that up at all. Yan is legitimately one of the most consistent team fighters in North America at that AD carry position, and man, he did his best to single-handedly win this game for Team Liquid. Core JJ was also really good as per usual, but Yan was just phenomenal for this team in this game, and I don't think you can, put him under the radar any longer. He's very quickly ascending to being like a top 3, top 4 AD carry in North America, and that's a tough place to be, right? Like, there are a lot of good ADCs in NA, but with a lot of them struggling right now, Yan's really quickly climbing those ranks, and he's going to be, close to the top a lot quicker than people expect if he continues to play like this, but the top side of the map was just not good enough, and that's really the difference maker for Team Liquid. That's what made them so dangerous in week number 1 was Summit and Pioshik playing well again, and in this game they didn't. They had basically no synergy. The Gnar was a complete problem for Team Liquid this entire game. He's going to get my dud of the game. Summit is in the top lane, and this is just what happens sometimes with Summit, especially on this Gnar pick. I found it very consistent that he's just not very good in team fights on this, although a couple of plays he did try to set up that didn't look all that bad were then interrupted by Pioshik. I specifically remember a 3-man Gnar ult that was interrupted by Wukong ult that actually didn't stun anybody, and so really kind of like anti-synergy there, maybe unlucky, but still unfortunate stuff. Neither of them, in my opinion, played all that well in this game, and I think they were a big reason why this team ended up losing. The Annie is basically just a stun bot by the end of the game, and Harry really isn't supposed to be the carry for Team Liquid. Anyways, this top side just needs to be good enough. Yan is a great team fighter. If you can get a situation where Summit and Pioshik are really active in the early game, generating leads and generating objective control for Team Liquid, and then you've got Yan and Core that are able to not only win isolated in the 2v2 because they're very good at that, but also team fight well, Team Liquid can still be one of the best teams in the league. But this was a frustrating loss, I think, for them and for a lot of other people. But nice win for Dig. They're now at 2-3. Certainly a better record than what they had at this point in spring. And so you're going to be excited about that. And a lot of that has to do with the new addition in the top lane who's looking just about as good as you could have wanted him to. And then moving on to our 5th game of day number 2 here, and it's another intriguing one, at least on paper. We had a matchup between Evil Geniuses and FlyQuest that Evil Geniuses is able to take to move to 4-1 on the split. Right at the top of the standings, they continue to be, and they look really good doing it. It's not just, these overpowering games against bad teams. They're going up against teams that are good. Maybe, FlyQuest doesn't exactly fall into that category at the current moment, but they're going up against teams that have talent, and they're just being able to execute on their game plan a little bit more consistently than the other teams that they are playing against right now, and that's really going to be the big difference maker between whether or not they can actually be a top 2, top 3 team in the league, and whether or not they're going to be able to, kind of fall down the standings again. And so really good to see Evil Geniuses continue to play well. My player of the game is again going to go to Armeo in the jungle. He continues to look very good, and man, you just have to be so excited for him as a player. He's been kind of locked in that tier 2, that I don't want to call him like a 4A player. Those of you who watch baseball know that phrase as that space where you're too good for the minor leagues, but just not good enough for the major leagues. It's kind of the perception that he had been getting over the last few years, and obviously that really was not the case. He was really, really good in Tier 2, in the Challengers League, in Academy, for quite a long time, for a really good Team Liquid team that continuously was producing LCS level talent. And so for him to finally get his shot here, obviously, he's going to make the most of it, and it's really fun to watch. He went up against Spica in this one, and was just the better jungler. There really was no other way to say it. He was just the better jungler in this series, but wasn't just him. Unforgiven and Ayla continue to be a very big positive in the bot lane. Unforgiven's obviously a very good player, but I would argue that he's been the less interesting of the two. Ayla had a really good game on the Rel. This is a champion that obviously has had a ton of prio over the course of this week so far. We've already brought it up a ton, but Ayla pilots it just as well as anybody, and this matchup in particular was very, very interesting. Ayla versus Vulcan is never not going to be a fun matchup, with Ayla and Vulcan swapping teams in the offseason, and obviously their Twitter beef that they had last split. It's always fun to see them go head-to-head, but Ayla definitely getting the better of him this time around, so good stuff from him. JoJo continues to be really fun. Revenge is, very quietly having a very nice split for a very good Evil Geniuses team. Basically, everything is clicking for this roster right now, and there really is nothing else to say other than, congratulations and be excited. They're going for these more aggressive style comps, a lot of full engage, and not really worrying about, the secondary consequences, if you will. Things like Nocturne Nico, very volatile duo that they ended up bringing out, adding on the Rel. You do have safety and things like the Zaya, but again, you gotta be trusting in yourself to execute comps like this, and they executed it very, very well in this game. But for FlyQuest, man, it's just a disaster. 0-5. There is nothing else to say other than that this team is completely and utterly falling apart at the current moment. And I really don't know what they need to do in order to get back on track, because I really don't know what is going wrong for this team, because it just feels like I said earlier this week, nothing is going right. Everything that this team did well in previous splits and that these players individually were known for, it's all gone out the window. They're not good anymore. Vicla's going to get another dud of the game here. He's leading the LCS in them after the first 5 days of games, and that's absurd. Nobody was going to predict that, even the people who were the lowest in the world on Vikla, and so I don't really know what's going on. I don't know what to expect. I don't know if, we should expect a turnaround. I don't know if it's the coaching. I don't know if it's the players. I don't know if it's the atmosphere. I don't know if it's the fit, but it is something. It's definitely at the very least one of those things, and, whatever it ends up being, they're going to have to figure it out fast. Prince and Vulcan were heavily outplayed by Unforgiven and Ayla on the other side of this map, and that's never going to be a good sign, really, at all for this team's success. Prince and Vulcan definitely need to step up. That was the big reason for optimism surrounding FlyQuest moving into the split, and so, again, to see them struggling, that's a concern. Impact and Spica have been fine. They've probably been the best part of this team, but that is to say the part that is the least bad, not necessarily the part that is good on this team. FlyQuest just continues to not really be able to make plays, not look proactive, not look good in the early game, and then just kind of collapse as the game continues to go on. I'm really not sure what this team needs to do in order to get themselves back on track, but whatever's going on right now, it's a disaster, and it's led to just about the worst possible start this team could have ever imagined. But for Evil Geniuses, it's basically the opposite. This is legitimately one of the best teams in the league, right up there with all the other teams that we've talked about. Cloud9, maybe on that stretch above, but that next tier of Team Liquid and Golden Guardians and all these other teams that we're really seeing a big uptick in terms of talent and in terms of consistency, Evil Geniuses is right there with them, and that, doing that with 4 major changes to the team in the middle of the season is just incredible stuff. You've got to give a lot of credit to the management that ended up deciding to make this decision to go with this roster, because obviously it's really working, but you got to give even more credit to the players because they were put in a tough situation and they've really come out on top. And now we get to jump into our final day of action here in week number 2 of the LCS, and we get to kick off our 3rd day with a matchup between TSM and Golden Guardians. That Golden Guardians is able to win 2 2-0 teams so far this week, going head-to-head to close out the week. Unfortunately for TSM, it's GG that's going to be able to come out on top as the better team to close off a 3-0 week for them. They came into the week 1-2. They're leaving the week 4-2. That's got to feel pretty damn good for a Golden Guardians team that really wanted to keep that MSI confidence and experience that they were able to generate moving forward into the rest of the year. And so really good to see them bounce back really nicely here in week number 2 and prove that they absolutely do belong near the top of the standings, and that me keeping them near the top of the standings was the right decision. Really proud of this team and really excited to see where they're going to continue to go. My player of the game is going to go to Licorice in the top lane. Man, he's actually been phenomenal ever since coming back from MSI. This was somebody who, for most of the last year or so before, the playoffs of last split, we were talking about as one of the worst top laners in the LCS. And, really, obviously, in hindsight, we now know the reason. And, he's been very vocal about how it took him getting away from the game a little bit, getting some better mental help away from the game, and being able to trust himself more in the decisions and the process that he's making more in order to really unlock that version of himself that he could be at his absolute best. But I just have to be excited for him because he's back. He really is back. It's not a fluke. It's not just temporary form. He is one of, if not the best top laner in North America at the current moment, and man, I'm just super excited to say that. He got counterpicked in this game. Playing the Jax into Gragas is not a particularly easy matchup in the laning phase in particular. Maybe later on in the game you can make a lot more impact, especially in side lanes, but in lane phase, that's actually a very difficult matchup to play out as Jax, and Licorice did not make it seem as such. He absolutely dominated lane phase. He was able to transition that giant gold lead into team fight pressure or side lane pressure for this team and really create a ton for Golden Guardians. The rest of the team following up really well. We have to talk about it. Stixxay getting a pentakill in this game, but he was like 0-1 going into that fight. Actually absurd. He had bad guns as well. Just goes to show the team fighting prowess of not only Stixxay, but of Golden Guardians as a whole. That was a weakness for this team. We have to remember, going back to spring, that was something we all thought was going to be a problem for this team. It certainly has not been a problem so far in summer. They've been very good in team fights. Stixxay definitely showing up. Licorice definitely showing up. And River and Goria have still been really good. The 2 import slots are definitely being put to good use on this Golden Guardians team. And so overall, you just got to be excited. Huki probably had his worst game of the week, and that should go to show you just how good of a week he had, because this was still a pretty damn good Leona game, even if it wasn't quite the rel that he had been pulling out earlier on. And so Golden Guardians looking pretty fantastic, and really, this team, I think, has proven at this point that the form and the success that they were able to find towards the back half of last split is certainly not going to just go away. And then for TSM, unfortunately, their really good week does come to an end in a rather unfortunate way, but they still looked really good this week. And even in this game, there were definitely moments where they could have won, and it was relatively close. Just a couple of misplays coming out from their players that ended up costing them. My dud of the game has to go to Hanser in the top lane. Ended up getting a really good matchup as the Gragas into the Jackson. Just got absolutely destroyed in that matchup, and that's never going to be great. He's been more up and down than maybe I'm giving him credit for on the channel. I know that there have been a couple of games that he hasn't looked great, but basically outside of 2 games, I would say, really their 2 big losses, he really has looked pretty good for this team, and so I don't want to overreact and say that he's a problem, but maybe he's a little bit more feast or famine than I'm giving him credit for. Certainly going into a player like Licorice that is kind of known for taking advantage of players that aren't as consistent, I think is a tough matchup for him, and unfortunately he wasn't able to hold up in this one. But Boogie was also pretty bad in the jungle. River definitely had more control, and the Maokai just never really felt all that relevant in this game. I want to give a ton of credit to Wild Turtle and Chime. Honestly, had the early game gone just a tad bit different, this game could have gone very, very differently, because Turtle was playing really well, but a lot of the early kills unfortunately ended up going onto the Alistar. And I think if you get that Xayah rolling and get that ball moving a little bit quicker for TSM, I think you might actually be looking at a win in this game for them. And so I certainly don't want to discredit them too much. They played really well against an actually good team, and I think, again, if a couple of things go their way, if Hanser just plays out the top lane matchup just a little bit better, I think TSM could be looking at a 3-0 week and a 4-1 record, or a 4-2 record, I should say, moving out of week number 2, which would be astounding for them. And this kind of continues a trend of them just kind of overperforming expectations. They did this last split in spring as well, and it looks like they're going to do it again in summer. I'm not saying that they're fantastic, but they're certainly better than a bottom 2 team in the league. And for Golden Guardians, they are a top 2 or top 3 team in the league. I really feel comfortable saying that. I feel confident that this team is going to continue to play at a high level. Now, one thing to keep in mind, they were very streaky last split. A lot of win streaks into loss streaks into win streaks into loss streaks, etc., etc. That might be the case again, or this team might have figured out a way to maintain some of their confidence and win streaks throughout the rest of the year. Either way, I feel pretty decent that this team is going to be able to be a threat, especially when we get down to playoff time. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 3, and it's another relatively interesting one, again, mostly based off the personnel. We had Immortals taking on 100 Thieves, and a couple of storylines going into this one, obviously. Tactical versus Double Lift is always an interesting matchup because of, you know, the Team Liquid days, always a fun thing to see go on there, but people forget that Double Lift and Treats played together for a little bit on TSM, and so a little bit of synergy there as well, just some things to keep in mind. But Immortals committed the cardinal sin against 100 Thieves, and they paid for it with 100 Thieves being able to take the win in this game. They gave Busio Rakan, and you just can't do that. Every other team in the league has learned that things like the Lucian and things like the Vi, that while this team are very good at, are not as high prio on the ban list as things like Rakan, because Busio really is a different player when he gets this champion, and it is very clear to see he's going to get my player of the game for this one. 400 Thieves, kind of breaking their losing streak here. They won their first game of the split, they then went on to lose 4 in a row. They finally did break it here on the final day, but Busio really needed to step up, and I think he did. He wasn't the only player on this team to play well, but he was probably the most noticeable, especially towards the back half of the game. Those Rakan engages were just really good. He's really good at this champion. He knows exactly when he needs to go in. He knows exactly how he can stay alive in a lot of these fights, which sometimes can be rather difficult on Rakan, and obviously, he's really good at being able to maximize CC and being able to maximize his ability to make an impact in these team fights. And so overall, really like what Busio was able to do, really like him, you know, as a player overall, but especially on this pick, he's just kind of a different animal. But a lot of people are going to walk away from this game talking about Double Lift, and for, you know, good reason. He basically played split push Xayah this entire game, which is absurd. He took so many towers and just created so much pressure on the map. He was playing it like it was Jax or Camille, but he was Xayah, and obviously Double Lift, kind of the innovator of split push AD carry metas. You know, back in the day, I remember Season 3, Season 4, he was playing Twitch in a very similar way. You know, a lot of different champions. Ezreal definitely came to mind. Urgot definitely came into mind for Double Lift. Playing a lot of those champions in more, like, side lane, more split pushy, tower-oriented, you know, kind of mentalities, and it's really not how you're supposed to play the AD carry position, or at least that's kind of what we've been taught, but Double Lift made it work here. Nobody was really there to punish him. Immortals really had bad macro basically the entire game, and they were not really able to keep up with 100 Thieves, even though they were making incredibly risky decisions. A lot of them did end up paying off. So the bot lane definitely kind of the focal point, but this was easily the best game that Quid has had at this time in the LCS, and that is a really good thing to say. He was active and proactive on the Ahri. He was much better in team fights, and he survived in the laning phase, and so that is a really good thing to take away. Hopefully it was just some nerves and maybe some miscommunications and maybe some jet lag or whatever, right? Maybe he was just getting used to the LCS, but this performance was significantly better than anything he showed previously in the week, and so that's good. Closer is still not as proactive as I would like him to be, but he wasn't making major mistakes in this game, so I'll take that. Sunday was fine on the Ornn. Mostly this was a bot lane focused game for 100 Thieves, and, you know, stop me if I've said this before, that's usually when they're able to win most of their games. But let's go ahead and talk about Immortals on the other side. After a pretty decent start in week number 1, going 2-1, winning some games that I think a lot of people didn't expect them to win, they go 0-3 in week number 2, and I've said it a lot this week for them, but it really does feel like they've come crashing back down to earth. Tactical is still playing at a very high level, and I still think he's doing relatively well. You watch a lot of these team fights, and if he has time, if he has a little bit of peel, he could probably win some of these fights for Immortals, but it's just not going to be the case. The Jinx is too far behind, and the rest of this team really isn't putting in a lot of work, I would say, overall. You could really give dud of the game to pretty much anybody on Immortals. I don't think there was one individual player that stood out as being significantly worse than anybody else. I liked the contributions of Balulu and Treats a little bit more, and I think Solo, it's hard to be mad at him for the Renekton game because he didn't really do anything bad. So I'm going to give it to Kenvi, although this was easily probably his best game of the week. Kenvi did not have a very good week here in the LCS in week number 2. He has weeks like this. He had plenty of them in 2022 as a year, just in general. But on the Sejuani in particular, it's just the kind of pick that I already talked about him not being particularly good on. If he is going to be on these engagers, he needs to be on something that can be more proactive. The Wukong or the Vi, you know, things of that nature. I don't think that the Sej or the Maokai or things of that style end up playing towards his strengths. Obviously, he's going to have Kindred permabanned against him, but you have options for other things, and it just doesn't feel like the Sedge really fits into the pool of things that he ends up being really good at. But he did not have a very good week, and Immortals in general didn't have a very good week. There were a lot of things you could point out needing to be done better by them, but hopefully they're able to make the adjustments. But it really does feel like maybe we jumped the gun on not calling them a bottom 2 team. But for 100 Thieves on the other side, at least they were able to pick up this win. They were in complete freefall mode, and this at the very least stops that for this week, but they're going to need to show a lot more in week number 3 and beyond in order for me to feel comfortable about them being anything other than just good enough. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 3, and this was the one I think in day number 3 that the most people were looking forward to, a battle of 4-1 teams as we saw Team Liquid taking on Evil Geniuses, And Evil Geniuses are able to pick up a massive win here. This is a team that even I really wasn't this high on moving into the split, and even I felt like I was pretty high on them, especially compared to other people's expectations, but they have blown basically everything out of the water. They're playing like one of the best teams in the LCS at the current moment, a top 2 team in the LCS, and they really just dethroned a team that looked absolutely unbeatable a week ago. And so you've got to be impressed with the just consistency and the development of this team as quickly as they have been able to do it. They've been playing together for maybe a month, like at most, and they're already this good. It's incredibly impressive from these players, and again, you got to give them a lot of credit in terms of being able to train up before the season, being able to click and develop a communication pattern, and I think really there are some individual performances that you really have to praise, and that starts really with the conversation around this mid lane position for Evil Geniuses. Player of the game has got to go to Jojo Pune, 100% kill participation on the Ahri while going deathless. I mean, come on, man. Like, it's absurd. It's absurd how good he is at this point. I know there are a lot of memes that are floating around right now, like Summer Split Jojo Pune, but Summer Split Jojo Pune hasn't exactly been a thing in the past. I would argue that he was worse in summer last year than he was in spring in his rookie year, and so to see him kind of jump into this team and really have a rough spring as well, at least a much rougher spring than what he had, last year, I think was definitely concerning about his future and his ability to play more consistently, and then now you're adding a bunch of talent around him that has, at times, looked shaky. Armeo's a good player, but not somebody who's looked great at the LCS level. Unforgiven is a great player, but not a shot caller. Ayla just came off of a really shaky split on FlyQuest, and so you were concerned that Jojo maybe wasn't going to be that same kind of player without the surrounding talent that he was kind of given in his first full year, but you know what? It's been the exact opposite. He's been a superstar on this team. He's taken over the shot calling duties. He's the main communicator on this team, and he's also playing like his life depends on it at the current moment. He is, without a doubt, right now, the front runner for MVP. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. I know it's super early on in the split, or you would think it's super early on in the split, but remember, we're 6 games in. We're like a third of the way through the split right now, and Jojo Pune, I think, definitely has asserted himself as the guy in the LCS right now, and it's super fun to watch, whether it's on proactive roamers and playmakers like this Ahri, or a more carry-oriented style, late game hyper carries like the Azir. He can play everything at a very high level. He was really good on the Jace as well if you want a lane pick. Like, he's just doing everything right now, and he's looking the best that he's arguably ever looked at this level. If he can keep this up, he might waltz his way to an MVP title, which would be incredibly impressive, and then the rest of this team still plays well. Like, Armeo looked really good on the Viego again in this game, and that's been a constant thread. We really haven't brought up Revenge all that much for this team in the top lane, but he's been very solid, and he's won lane super consistently for them, even if he hasn't exactly been the most important in the team fights. And then Unforgiven and Ayla are really good. I do want to say Unforgiven has really not been given a huge role on this team, and I think that that's fine. That's a relatively good thing overall with how well the jungle mid is doing right now. You don't need the bot lane to step up and be like super resource heavy, high intensive, carries down in that lane. You just need them to be able to add on to the rest of the team, and that's what Unforgiven has been doing. He's going to be able to step up if you give him the responsibility as well. He's just not necessarily needed to do that up until this point, and Ayla's been phenomenal for this team, and so everybody on EG really just clicking right now, and it just goes to show you how investing in talent that has performed at other levels is often the key to success, and finding a group of people that want to communicate and want to play together and can find a nice pathway to success is significantly more valuable than just getting, the most mechanically talented players you can find. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, they're kind of the opposite of this, right? They are the most mechanically talented players you can find. And while they do have some synergy, I'm certainly not going to say that they're a bad team overall. The cracks are still there. The problems that they had in spring have not just magically gone away, and a lot of them were very present in not only this series or this game, but this week in general. Dud of the game is going to go to Summit again in the top lane. Another rough one for him, and, he's really kind of the pinnacle of what we talk about when it comes to Team Liquid. An incredibly talented player, someone who's been very good in lane. When you look at the stats, he's just so far ahead of every other top laner. He was last split as well in terms of basically every countable stat that you could possibly have for laning, but by the time we get to the late game team fights, he's nowhere to be found. He's consistently disconnected from the rest of his team, and he's really not helping the team win, if we're being entirely honest. And that's kind of the case for Team Liquid. As good as they are and as talented as they are, they're just not a unit at the current moment, and hopefully hopefully you can figure something out, because it's really frustrating to watch players that are this good just not be able to make it work. Like, I know they're only 4-2, like, I'm not going to try to overreact. They went undefeated in week number 1, but if you're going to play the best teams in the league and just not look nearly as, coordinated as you need to, even when you are able to generate some lane leads, that's super frustrating to watch. And so hopefully Summon and Pyosik in particular can figure it out. Pyosik is getting the Kindred now. People are leaving it up for him because they realize that if they just disconnect him from the rest of the team, the Kindred really isn't that scary of a pick, as good as he is on it. And so for Yawn, if he's going to be on Ashe, that certainly doesn't have the same kind of late game carry potential that they need. And he's really been the only player that has been reliably able to step up in the late game. And so I don't really know what Team Liquid is going to do. Not going to be doom or gloom about them, but they might have a ceiling in the league, and that's kind of a frustrating thing to say with how good they look at their absolute best. But for Evil Geniuses, they don't have a ceiling. They're really, really solid right now. One of the best teams in the entire league, led by an MVP frontrunner at the current moment, and you've just got to be excited for this team and for the players, because all of them have really put in their dues and really put in the work to get to this spot, and it really is paying off at the current moment. And then moving on to our fourth game here of day number 3, and it's another that is just brutal to talk about. We had FlyQuest taking on Dignitas, and Dignitas does pick up the win. Congratulations to this team, but FlyQuest officially 0-6 after the first 2 weeks of the season. This is not how they expected this to go. I don't think this is how anyone expected this to go. This is maybe the most disastrous start that any team has had in the history of any major region. Like, I can't imagine there is a scenario or a circumstance where a team had this many expectations going into this split, had their expectations set so high of not only being, a good team in the league, but legitimately thinking they could be the best team in the league, and then just not being able to win a game. I can't remember a time where that has ever happened in the history of League of Legends. If there has, and I'm forgetting something, let me know down in the comment section below, but this is astounding, and you just have to be shocked, because there really is no other answer towards why this is happening. Congratulations to Dig, though, on being able to pick up this win. They already look so much better in week 2 than they did in week 1. Honestly, kind of reminds me of what Immortals looked like in week number 1, so I don't want to overreact to their good form right now, but they were able to pick up a win over FlyQuest. If you told them that at the beginning of the year, they would have felt incredibly excited about that. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, pretty easily going to go to Tomo on this Aphelios. He looked really good. This is somebody who I think has taken a little bit of a step back since his spring performance, where I think a lot of people were really excited about him. He was definitely more explosive and more aggressive than Spawn when he took his spot in spring, and I think he was definitely better for this team, and now he's getting his, academy of his longtime academy support back as his starting LCS support here in Diamond as well, and we were kind of just hoping that that would give them better synergy in the bot lane than what Tomo and Ignar had last split, which really just was fine at best. But honestly, it's kind of been worse, if I'm being honest. Diamond has just not really been able to hold up at this level, which is disappointing, because this is another player who has just been fantastic at the NACL and Academy level for so many years, and just doesn't seem like he's ever going to be able to make that transition super successfully to the LCS. But Tomo had a really good game on the Aphelios, especially in the team fights. He was really the one that ended the game as quickly as it ended. You're kind of looking at the score, and you're looking at the time and being like, something must have gone wrong here for FlyQuest very quickly, and that was the case. Tomo got online, and the game was over pretty quickly, and so credit to him. Jensen was really good in this game on the Annie, really setting up a lot of the plays. Isn't going to get a lot of the focal point, but again, put him on more supportive picks, put him on something that he doesn't have to be the big focal point carry on, and I think he's going to look a lot better. He's just not the player that's really going to succeed at that style. And then Rich was good on the Quinn as well. Really like to see Quinn at the LCS level. This is something that we're seeing a little bit more globally, especially in the LPL, and so not surprising to see Rich bring it out as a counter to the Renekton. It, historically is very good into Renekton in the laning phase, and so I get the point of it, but I could definitely see some teams maybe exploiting it a little bit harder than FlyQuest did in this one. But Rich, Jensen, Tomo looked good. Diamond and Centauran are still looking a little bit rough, at least in terms of film, but whatever ends up working in order to get the win, that's all that really matters. And so congratulations to Dig for being able to pick this one up. FlyQuest on the other side, like I said, just disaster. I mean, there's nothing else to say. There is literally no more analysis for me to give. Everything has gone wrong for this team, and they need a complete overhaul. I imagine their coaching staff is probably going to be the first thing to go, but if this team needs changes, like, where do you make them? Who is getting benched? Like, I have no idea. Everyone is playing bad right now, and so I can't even imagine, where you would pinpoint a problem or a potential solution for this team at the current moment, which is probably the scariest thing I could say. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Vulcan on the Nautilus. Just A couple of really bad engages from him, but realistically, like, everybody on this team was bad. Spica on the Ivern did literally nothing the entire game. Santorin had more pressure just by breathing than the Ivern did. Vikla and Prince were doing damage, but they certainly weren't playing aggressive. Not that Azir and Kai'Sa should be playing aggressive, but it's not like they were dragging this team back into the game or anything like that. And then Impact has just been whatever on the top side the entire split. I don't really know what to say about this FlyQuest team. I don't know what's going wrong, so I don't know what to tell them to fix or what to give you analysis as to what can go right. I don't know. This team is 0-6 and they look utterly incapable of winning a game at the current moment. Hopefully they can figure something out, because if they can't, like, it's just a complete disaster for this organization and for this team that is spending what I presume to be a ridiculous amount of money here. And, you know, we're at the point where they're going to have to start kicking it into gear to not be bottom two. Obviously, still way too much season left to even talk about that in terms of the standings, but you can't be 0-8 or 0-9. You got to be able to figure something out. You can't even really be like 1-8 or 1-9. You certainly don't want to be in that predicament as we get further down the stretch. And so the quicker that they figure things out, the better off they're going to be, especially with the time limit and the condensed schedule. But for Dig, they're at 500. I know they're very sneakily at 500, but if I had to guess, it's a little bit of a phony 500. Their wins are not against, I mean, they're against good teams, but they're not teams that they should be consistently beating. Team Liquid, FlyQuest, like, these aren't teams that I would expect Dignitas to be able to consistently be better than. And so, you know, they are 500, they are 3-3, but they might be looking a little bit worse as the season continues on. And finally, moving on to our final game of the week here in week number 2 of the LCS, and it was a good one. An upset here as we saw Cloud9 taking on NRG, and upholding the tradition of Counter Logic Gaming, NRG is able to take down the undefeated Cloud9. Absolutely insane here. Obviously, we all kind of saw this one coming in the back of our peripheral minds, with NRG struggling as much as they currently are, really not being able to buy a win, and Cloud9 looking generally unstoppable. Of course, NRG were going to be able to win this one. It's just how the LCS works, honestly. It's just how League of Legends works in general, whether it be the LEC or the LPL. Really, the only place that well, I guess I should say it happens in the LCK as well. I was going to say it doesn't, but you know what? Bro just beat DK a couple weeks ago, or, you know, whatever. So it's certainly not an upset in terms of mentality, just, you know, NRG being able to win here is shocking from a League of Legends perspective. I will definitely say that, but this team still has a lot of freaking talent on it, and I know that we've kind of lost track of that because they haven't exactly been playing up to that talent level at the beginning of this split so far, but Dokka, Contracts, and Palafox, whatever you want to think of FBI and Ignar, whether they are an upgrade or a downgrade or a side grade to Luger and Poom, whatever you want to think about them, Dokka, Contracts, and Palafox are still really good players. They're upper half players in terms of what they've been able to do over the course of their careers, and they've not really performed up to that standard so far in Summer Split, but in this game, they definitely re-showed up. Palafox in particular, who's going to get my player of the game on that. Azir, really, really good stuff from him. Really like to see him be aggressive on a pick that isn't necessarily known for being aggressive. He was willing to move around the map. He was willing to try and take these skirmishes. NRG in general wanted to play a lot more for topside in this game, and I think that that is absolutely the strategy that they should be going for. The fact that they weren't doing that in their first couple of games was incredibly infuriating, and I talked about it a ton on this channel, where it's like, it's a no-brainer. Play for Dokka, play for Palafox, play for Contracts. FBI is a fantastic weak side player, and Ignar's not really someone you want to give a ton of resources to, and so I really like this idea of moving the resources up towards the top side of the map, and honestly, it gives me a lot of hope and upside. If Palafox is going to play like this, as opposed to what he did in week number 1, where he quite frankly was pretty bad, and he was a lot better this week, easily the best player on this team in week number 2. Hopefully you're going to get that version of him. It really does feel like he's back, and this is a player that I've just praised all the time on this channel. Hopefully I'm going to be able to continue to do that. Dokka was a lot better, although still inconsistent. I want to see him be a little bit more careful in terms of the plays that he makes, but he's a really good Jace, and the damage that he's able to put out is still ludicrous, especially when the rest of the team is willing to input resources and kind of play into him, which they were in this game. Contracts looked phenomenal on the Wukong. You really love to see that, and FBI and Ignar were good in the bot lane 2v2. They didn't need to create a ton of pressure themselves, and so they were just kind of allowed to get to that point where the Kai'Sa could actually team fight really efficiently, and they got there, and that's all you really needed to see from this team. You got to be happy for them, because it really does feel like CLG from Spring Split is at least a little bit back in terms of what they were able to do in this game. Now, if they're able to replicate that over the next couple of weeks, that's going to be big, but that's still a major if, because, you know, Cloud9 losing here is still an upset. We got to be honest. Like, them not being able to take this game was definitely not probably on their bingo card, but, you know, walking out of week 2 5-1 still has to be pretty good. Unfortunately, they drafted a comp that doesn't play to any of their strengths. Blabber's going to get my dud of the game because he just wasn't very good, and that's kind of been a trend for him on Vi in particular as a champion. I think he's got like a 20% career win percentage on Vi, and that's not good considering how much Blabber has won over the course of his career. He's basically never not been on a #1 team in the league, and so not a lot of situations where he's just kind of been losing. I think he's got like a 60 or 70% career win rate, and so 20% on Vi, not good, and it definitely shows on tape. He's just not super comfortable on the champion. I know that he's a good engager, and we know he can be good in the early game, but just whatever the reason, the tools of Vi just don't mesh with him, and whatever it is, just move away from the pick. There are plenty of other junglers in the game that do things that Vi does in a similar manner, whether that be, Sejuani was banned here, but, there are a lot of other junglers that I think you can engage on that I would be more comfortable on. Even something like the Kindred was left up here, and I would like to see some aggression, some challenging out of this Cloud9 team I think they could have gone for, but Blabber wasn't very good. Fudge was very coin flippy, a couple of really good plays on the Kennen, but also gave a lot of gold over to the enemy team, so that's worth noting. Eminence was basically irrelevant, and Berserker and Sven really didn't play all that well in this game. The Yuumi died a lot more than she probably should have, especially early on, and so Cloud9 honestly just got outplayed. There really is not much else to say. They're going to be able to bounce back. I still think they're the best team in the league, but it certainly is worth noting that they shouldn't have dropped this game, and they did anyways. But congratulations to Energy. They're going to be able to close off week 2 with a really nice win, and hopefully this is the kind of confidence-building game that they needed in order to push themselves back into the position they probably should have been in the entire time. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCS Week 2 overview and analysis video. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen now are going to be the updated standings after Week 2 here in the LCS. Any ties are just going to be broken alphabetically, no favoritism shown here. In the first column on the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers. C9 staying at #1. Not really going to shock a lot of people with how I talked this week, but Golden Guardians jumping up to #2 from #3, Evil Geniuses jumping up to #3, and Team Liquid falling down to #4. Those are the top 4 teams in the league, and I feel like this order is relatively locked in for me. Evil Geniuses could be 2 and Golden Guardians could be 3, but I just trust GG a tad bit more at the current moment with what they've been able to do last split. And Evil Geniuses is looking really good, but their schedule has also not been as tough, I would say, as what GG has gone through at the start of the split. I think they're very, very close, but for now, Golden Guardians going to stay at 2, and Evil Genius is going to go up to 3. That means Team Liquid does drop down 2 spots. I probably just moved them up a little bit too high after last week. I thought they really were starting to figure out a lot of their weaknesses, but maybe it was just them taking advantage of some of their weaker opponents. Top 4 still feels pretty reasonable for them, and I think top 4 is pretty locked in the LCS at the current moment. But #5 is where it gets really spicy, because I have TSM, and this is a ranking that is almost certainly not going to stick. There's no way they're the 5th best team in the league, right? There's just not a chance that they are the 5th best team in the league. They've looked like the 5th best team in the league up until this point, but like I've talked about a lot in this video, it looks like Ruby's going to be stepping back in for Insanity, and I think that's going to hamper this team's ability to win some games. But I think even outside of that, their talent has been overperforming expectations up until this point. But for now, there really is nobody else that I can put above them, because everyone else has underperformed so much. 100 Thieves stays put at 6. That should show you just how not good the rest of this league is, in my opinion. Fly drops down to 7. I'm still being cautious in a sense. They started the split, but in the preseason as, a title contender. And then when they went 0-3, I took them out of title contention and said they really need to work to be top 6. And now that they're 0-6, I'm taking them out of top 6 and saying next week, if they still can't figure things out, not if they're 0-9, but if they're, if they're 0-9, they're 10th. It's just it's the way things go. But if they're, 1-8, if they're 2-7 even, I'm probably still going to be looking at this team as 8th or 9th. I need to see drastic growth from this team. I'm still expecting it to happen at some point, but for now, they're going to fall to 7. Very likely could be falling to 9 or 10 as the split continues on. But number 8 is going to be Energy. I really toyed around with having them in the bottom 2, especially because Dignitas is in the bottom 2 at the current moment, which them being 500 feels very weird, especially with wins over Team Liquid and FlyQuest this week. But I just don't trust this team moving forward nearly as much as their record says at the current moment. It feels like they're taking advantage of some teams with major weaknesses and major mess ups at the current moment, and I just don't expect that to be a trend that they can continue on. Immortals felt pretty comfortable dropping down to 10 after their miserable week, though, so, top 4 feels pretty locked, but anything 5 to 10, they're all going to be moving in a lot of different ways, and even top 4 is probably going to be expandable or contractable as the split goes on, but for now, this just kind of feels right, and so I wouldn't take the numbers, especially 5 down, particularly seriously, but top 4 is what I would say is how I'm feeling at the current moment. But with that being said, for power rankings, let's go ahead and talk about my player of the week and and my dud of the week in week number 2, my player of the week. Pretty tough choice, 2 very good candidates this week, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Armeo, the jungler for Evil Geniuses. He was just super good in all 3 of their games. I think he was the most consistent player across the entire week, creating advantages. Evil Geniuses has been an absolute treat to watch, and he's a big part of that. I think his ability to control the jungle and honestly carry a bit more than I think people expected is a big reason why EG has looked so good. The other player is obviously Huhi, that I really considered for player of the week here. It's got to be one of those 2 players, but for me, I ended up landing on Armeo just slightly over Huhi because of that 3rd and final game. But dud of the week for me in week number 2 was an even tougher decision because a ton of players were really bad in week number 2. I mean, Quid was definitely like a finalist for dud of the week, and basically anybody on FlyQuest, Vikla in particular, was definitely being considered. Summit was definitely in consideration. There were so many players that were on the chopping block for dud of the week, but what I ended up landing on for dud of the week for me was Immortals jungler Kenvi. I just thought he had the worst individual week of any player in the LCS. It felt like he was outclassed in every single game that he played, and it very much felt like 2022 Kenvi, more than it felt like Spring Kenvi, where it started to feel like he was moving in the right direction. Hopefully he can figure things out, but Immortals in general felt like a disaster this week, and I think Kenvi was kind of the epitome of that. So my dud of the week in week 2 is going to go to Kenvi. My player of the week is going to go to Armeo, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below whether you agree or disagree on a lot of my takes. Of course, keep it civil, keep it discussion-oriented, no screaming and ranting down in the comment section below unless you really want to do that, but probably not going to respond to those comments, just kind of a heads up. But, of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people as well. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. We cover the LCS every single week on this channel, not only the LCS, but all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in comprehensive LoL esports coverage, this is the place for it. Hit the subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.